So for those of you who don't know, there was a new recent round of pedophilia accusations against the Catholic Church. There was the story from years back about how, oh shit, they were in like a systematic way, they were doing pedophilia and then covering it up. Well, now we learned about new examples of it. I think one was in Pennsylvania, where it was particularly egregious, and then another one in Ireland. So with media spotlight being on this issue, there's a lot of pressure on the Pope. Now remember, this is the Pope that is more open-minded than previous popes, so people are expecting certain things from him. Well, he recently went to Ireland, and he was asked about this sex abuse, and he spoke to some of the victims and whatnot. Let's watch a short little news clip on it here, and then we'll discuss.
Pope Francis addressed sex abuse directly in his first speech inside Dublin Castle, saying the church must remove the scourge at whatever moral cost.
Sono ben consapevole.
The failure of the ecclesial authorities, bishops, religious superiors, priests, and others to adequately address these repugnant crimes has rightly given rise to outrage, he said. They were familiar words, some first penned by the Pope in his letter to all Catholics earlier this week. Ireland's Prime Minister, who hosted the Pope, said they weren't enough.
As you said, there can only be zero tolerance for those who abuse children or facilitate that abuse. And we must now ensure that from words flow actions.
The Pope is making his way down the street in his Pope-mobile. This is one of the most Catholic countries in the world, and he is waving to an Ireland that has seen seismic change in the last 4 decades.
Over that period, Ireland has legalized divorce, gay marriage, and most recently abortion in what some have called referendums against the church. Today's noticeably small crowds, another strong message. When Pope John Paul II visited in 1979, he was greeted by more than 2.5 million faithful.
Young people of Ireland, I love you.
I believed him, and it really meant something to me. And a year and a half later, I was raped by a priest for the first time. And that continued for 2.5 years.
Colm O'Gorman says he was abused when he was 14 years old.
They have no moral authority because at the highest level of the institution, they colluded with, they facilitated, and they covered up those crimes. And they allowed them to go unchecked.
And this evening, the Pope met privately with several victims of church abuse. Tomorrow, he will say Mass before a crowd of about 500,000 people. Rena, hundreds more are expected to protest.
If an organization or a person or a group of people had a direct line to God, would they be the type of organization to cover up mass child rape and shuffle around priests from one parish to another in order to avoid justice? I think that's a pretty easy question to answer. And I think it's fascinating that on the biggest moral issues of our time, the people who are supposed to be the moral leaders are always lagging. They're not leading, they're lagging. Now, I'm not saying all Catholics or all Christians are guilty of this stuff and should feel bad about it or whatever. If you're not personally responsible, you're not personally responsible. But I do think that should give you pause about the institution. And I do think that you should be able to look at it objectively and say, oh, this isn't what I thought it was. I mean, ultimately, when you look at the Pope, and you look at a lot of the leaders in the Catholic Church, they're old men dressed as wizards pretending to have superpowers. They don't have superpowers. They're not wizards. And in many ways, they were a criminal ring covering up the worst kinds of crimes. I mean, it doesn't get worse than child rape. And they were doing it, and the details of it are absolutely gruesome, man. I mean, absolutely horrendous. And by the way, for people who are already ready to, give Pope Francis credit, oh, look, he said he spoke about it and he was against it, yada, yada. First of all, what a low bar. What a moral man. He's against child rape. Moral man. But then also, later on, he was asked about, I think, a specific example that there are allegations of him maybe covering up or protecting a certain priest who did some of these things. And he said no comment. He's like, I'm not going to comment on that. So, in other words, it's the fake moral grandstanding of like, yes, I think this is wrong and we should try to fix this. And it's like, oh, what about that case where you were maybe involved with this particular priest? No comment. I have nothing to say about that. Listen, I think that as a result of this, you're going to see more and more people leave. I mean, that's what's going to happen. You're going to see more and more people leave because even if you're somebody, and this is what's happening with the younger generation, there's a rise in atheism and agnosticism, but there's also a rise in just non-theists. So in other words, people might be deists, which means they believe in God, but not a God of any particular denomination, but they're just not part of organized religion. I think that's the result of this. You have an uptick among millennials of atheism, agnosticism, but you also have an uptick among people who say stuff like, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. That happens. And I think that that's going to be the direction history goes. Because listen, if you're willing to look at what's happening and think about it, you're going to come to the same conclusion pretty fast. That conclusion being, at the very least, these people do not have a direct line to God, and they don't represent something holier than thou. It's an institution, it's an organization of corrupt, fraudulent men, and I do mean men, because they don't have women, and it's terrible. So, it's one of those instances of too little too late there, Pope Francis. If you are going to, after the fact, go, oh yeah, it was kind of fucked up, wasn't it? Hey, what about that time you were involved maybe? No comment. You're not leading on moral issues. You know what a leader on moral issues does? They get out there and they, before anybody else is even saying it, they're leading the charge. A moral leader would be somebody going out there saying, hey man, I think physician-assisted suicide is the moral position. Instead, the Catholic Church is fighting it. That's just one example, but the examples go on and on. A moral leader would go out there and rail against U.S. imperialism and say, look at all the people dying as a result of our offensive wars. Catholic Church isn't doing that. So, the emperor has no clothes. Or in this instance, I guess, the man-wizard has no hat.